At exactly 9:40 that morning, something was wrong, and General Karl Weissman felt it before he understood it. The silence came first. Not the peaceful silence of dawn, but a hollow one, unnatural, as if the land itself were holding its breath. The birds were gone. The distant artillery that had rumbled for weeks had stopped. Even the wind seemed hesitant to move. Weissman, a man who had survived more campaigns than he cared to remember, stood motionless near the edge of a shattered orchard outside St. Lo, listening to a quiet that did not belong on a battlefield. Then the ground began to tremble. It wasn't sudden. It wasn't violent. It was subtle, almost polite, rising through the soles of his boots like a warning whispered by the earth itself. Only after that did the sound arrive. A distant, rolling thunder, steady and immense, growing louder, not by seconds, but by heartbeats. Weissman looked up. The sky was moving. At first, he thought his eyes were betraying him. Dark shapes slid across the blue, multiplying, aligning, filling space where moments ago there had been nothing. He raised his binoculars with the slow deliberation of a man who already suspected the truth. Aircraft. Not a formation. A procession. He began to count. 4 at a time. Then another 4. Then rows upon rows, stretching so far that the horizon itself seemed crowded. Fighter bombers screamed downward ahead of them, but behind came something far worse. Massive 4-engine bombers advancing with mechanical patience, indifferent to what waited below. When Weissman reached 1,000, he stopped. No commander trained for this. No experience prepared a man to watch the sky become a ceiling of steel. The sun dimmed. Shadows raced across fields, roads, villages. Entire landscapes swallowed under a moving darkness. Around him, soldiers stared upward in stunned silence, suddenly aware that courage, discipline, and experience might no longer matter. Weissman understood then that this was not an attack. It was a verdict. What followed would last only 45 minutes, but it would erase years of training, months of fighting, and the lives of men who believed they were ready for anything, except the moment when the sky itself decided the battle was over. If you want to understand how modern war truly began, how one morning changed everything, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us bring you more powerful, untold stories like this. Now, a quick question for you. Do you think the general already knew his army was doomed when he saw the sky fill with bombers? A. Yes, he knew it was over. B. No, he still believed they could survive. Comment A or B below. I want to hear what you think. They had not been built to retreat. They had been built to instruct victory. General Karl Weissman's division was never meant to be just another unit on the map. Inside the German army, it was spoken of with a quiet confidence, almost reverence. This was the formation other divisions were sent to observe, to learn from, to copy. Its purpose was not merely to fight, but to demonstrate what a modern armored force should look like when doctrine, training, and technology aligned perfectly. Every man in its ranks carried experience like a second uniform. These were not recruits learning fear for the first time. They were veterans who had already paid for their survival with scars, losses, and memories they rarely spoke about. Tank commanders who had maneuvered under fire in open deserts. Infantrymen who had learned how quickly hesitation could get a man killed. Mechanics who could coax a broken engine back to life under bombardment. They believed in preparation. They believed in systems. And above all, they believed in each other. The machines reinforced that belief. Their tanks were new, heavy with armor and promise. Their engines tuned with the confidence of factories still working at full capacity. Radios crackled clearly when so many other units relied on runners and guesswork. Infantry rode into position protected by steel, not canvas. In a war increasingly defined by exhaustion and improvisation, this division still looked like it belonged to the future. Weizmann had shaped that culture deliberately. He demanded precision, but rewarded initiative. He believed that disciplined men, given the right tools, could solve almost any problem a battlefield presented. For months, the division had proven him right. In the hedgerows of Normandy, they had stopped advances, counterattacked with skill, and forced the enemy to bleed for every yard of ground. Yet beneath the confidence, cracks were forming. Fuel shortages meant tanks waited longer than they should. Replacement crews arrived with less training than the men they replaced. And above all, the sky no longer belonged to them. Each daylight movement carried risk. Each engine start felt like a flare inviting destruction from above. Still, morale held, because belief is powerful. Soldiers wrote letters home describing themselves as steady, professional, ready. They cleaned weapons, shared jokes, argued about routes and tactics. These small rituals mattered. They were proof that order still existed, that control had not yet slipped away. None of them believed they were invincible, but they believed they were prepared. What they couldn't imagine, what no amount of training had prepared them for, was a form of war where preparation itself would become irrelevant, where skill would be drowned out by volume, and where an entire army could be erased not by defeat, but by overwhelming force descending from the sky. The land itself was the enemy long before either side understood it. Normandy did not look dangerous from a distance. Rolling fields, narrow lanes, green hedges dividing farmland that had been worked by the same families for centuries. But once men entered that landscape with rifles and tanks, it revealed its true nature. The hedgerows were not fences, they were walls, thick earthen embankments crowned with roots and trees, high enough to block vision, strong enough to stop armor cold. Every field was a room. Every exit was a doorway waiting for death. For American infantry, the advance became a slow-motion nightmare. Progress was measured not in miles, but in hedges. Each one had to be approached blindly. Each one could hide a machine gun, a mortar, a man who had been waiting all night with his finger already tightening on the trigger. Men learned to fear silence more than gunfire. Silence meant someone was watching. For General Karl Weissmann's soldiers, the hedgerows offered protection, but at a terrible cost. Defense meant immobility. Tanks could not maneuver. Units became isolated. Communication broke down into shouted orders and hand signals. Victory came not from sweeping movement, but from endurance, from waiting and reacting again and again. The fighting drained both sides in ways that numbers could not capture. Men slept in shallow holes scraped into damp earth, never fully resting. Rain soaked uniforms, mud clung to boots and weapons. The smell of cordite and decay lingered in the air, heavy and constant. Days blurred together into a cycle of tension and release, long hours of waiting punctuated by seconds of violence. Commanders on both sides began to speak in comparisons that unsettled even themselves. This was not how the war was supposed to look in 1944. This felt older, slower, closer to something the world had sworn never to repeat. The hedgerows turned modern armies into collections of frightened, exhausted men fighting at arm's length. Weizmann understood the danger of success here. His division was holding, inflicting losses, buying time. But time for what? Every day spent in the green maze cost irreplaceable men and machines. Every night brought the same question: how long before something broke? The Americans asked a different question. How many men could they afford to lose before the invasion itself lost momentum? The hedgerows created a stalemate that felt endless. But stalemates do not last forever. Somewhere beyond the fields and the mud, a decision was forming, one that wouldn't respect hedges, skill, or courage, a decision designed to bypass the maze entirely. And when it came, the land that had bled men dry would no longer matter at all. The decision was not born in confidence, it was born in exhaustion. General Thomas Harlan stood over a map that no longer felt honest. The lines on it suggested movement, arrows pushing forward, objectives neatly labeled. Reality was different. Reality arrived each morning as casualty reports and unanswered questions. Men were advancing, yes, but they were advancing into a grinder that consumed time, morale, and lives at a rate no plan had anticipated. Harlan had commanded men long enough to recognize the moment when doctrine failed. The invasion was succeeding on paper, but stalling in practice. The hedgerows were doing what German divisions alone could not, slowing an army built for speed into something hesitant and bleeding. What frightened him most was not the losses. It was the pattern. Every day of delay gave the enemy time. Every field fought over was another day the war did not end, and Harlan understood the larger truth that haunted all modern commanders. Wars were no longer won by bravery alone. They were won by momentum. Lose that, and even victory could rot into stalemate. The idea he carried into the room felt almost heretical. Strategic bombers, aircraft designed to erase factories, rail yards, entire city blocks, brought down not on distant industry, but onto a narrow strip of earth directly in front of his own troops. No commander in his position could pretend ignorance of the risks. These bombers flew high. Their bombs fell fast and imprecise. Wind, smoke, timing, any of it could turn calculation into catastrophe. His air officers argued with him, calmly at first, then urgently. They spoke of margins of error measured in hundreds of yards, of men who would die wearing the same uniform as the pilots overhead, of a line that, once crossed, could not be uncrossed. Harlan listened, then he nodded. He approved the plan. Not because it was elegant, not because it was safe, but because it offered what nothing else could: finality, the kind of violence that did not negotiate with terrain or wait for daylight. A single, overwhelming blow meant to shatter resistance rather than wear it down. Orders went out quietly. Infantry would pull back. Markers would be laid. The bombers would come in fast, perpendicular to the front. There would be no second guessing once they were airborne. Word traveled, as it always does. German observers noticed the withdrawal and understood immediately. American soldiers sensed something enormous was coming, something beyond artillery, beyond tactics. Fear settled on both sides, not of defeat, but of what they were about to unleash, because everyone involved knew the same thing. Once the sky was called in as a weapon, there would be no clean hands left in the outcome. The first sound did not come from the sky. It came from the earth. General Karl Weissman felt it as a steady pressure beneath his feet, a vibration so constant it blurred into the rhythm of his pulse. Then the sound followed, deep, layered, impossible to place at first, as if the horizon itself had begun to hum. Men looked at one another, searching for reassurance in familiar faces, but found none. When Weissman raised his eyes, the horizon was no longer a line. It was movement. Aircraft poured into view in disciplined formations, their silhouettes multiplying until the sky seemed to fold inward. The air filled with the roar of engines, not chaotic or frenzied, but precise, industrial, relentless. Fighter bombers raced ahead, diving with screaming urgency, while behind them came the heavy bombers, massive and steady, advancing with the patience of machinery that did not doubt its purpose. The sunlight thinned, then dimmed. Shadows stretched and merged until the ground below existed under a single, shifting darkness. It felt less like an attack than an occupation, an invasion from above. Weisman began to count without realizing he had started. His mind searched for scale, for a number that could make sense of what he was seeing. But the formations continued, horizon to horizon, until counting became meaningless. This was not force concentration. It was accumulation. Weight. Volume. Around him, men stood frozen, helmets tilted back, mouths slightly open. No orders were given, because no orders could change what was unfolding. Radios crackled uselessly. Officers lowered binoculars with hands that no longer felt steady. Weisman understood something then that no battlefield manual had ever taught him. War had shifted planes, literally and morally. This was not a contest of maneuver or endurance. It was arithmetic. How much steel could be delivered, how quickly, and onto how small a piece of earth. As the bombers aligned and held their course, the general felt a certainty settle over him, cold and absolute. Whatever came next would not ask whether his men were ready. It would simply arrive. The first bombs did not feel like explosions. They felt like the end of gravity. The earth rose violently, then collapsed inward, over and over, as if the ground itself were being torn apart and reassembled incorrectly. General Karl Weisman was thrown to one knee by the force of it, the air punched from his lungs before he ever heard the sound. Then the noise arrived, an unbroken roar so vast that individual detonations disappeared into a single, continuous scream. There were no pauses, no rhythm, just impact stacked upon impact. Bombs fell in dense patterns, walking across fields, roads, and positions with mechanical indifference. Trenches vanished in seconds. Trees lifted into the air and disintegrated. Tanks were hurled sideways, flipped onto their backs like dead animals, their armor suddenly irrelevant. Men were not killed so much as erased. Those who survived the initial blasts were buried alive, entombed by collapsing earth. Others staggered into the open, eyes wide, mouths working soundlessly, their minds overwhelmed by concussion and terror. Veterans who had endured years of combat now sat motionless in craters, incapable of speech or command. Courage had nowhere to go. Training had nothing to grip. Communication ceased almost immediately. Radios went silent. Telephone lines vanished beneath pulverized soil. Runners sent forward never returned. Within minutes, command itself became meaningless. Weisman tried to impose order, to understand, to regain control, but the scale defeated comprehension. This was not a battle unfolding. It was an environment being destroyed. 45 minutes in which time itself seemed to lose structure, measured only by the relentless continuation of violence. When the bombing finally lifted, the silence that followed was worse than the noise. The landscape no longer resembled terrain. It was a churned wasteland of overlapping craters, smoke, and scattered debris. Units existed only as fragments. Reports, when they came, spoke of devastation beyond precedent. More than half his forward forces were gone, dead, wounded, buried, or broken beyond recovery. In less than an hour, an elite division had not been defeated. It had been removed from the war. The bombs did not stop caring who wore which uniform. Even as the German lines were being crushed into silence, the violence spilled backward, crossing the invisible boundary meant to protect the men waiting to advance. Smoke and dust thickened the air, swallowing landmarks, confusing timing and distance. Pilots, flying high above the chaos, released their loads by instruments and seconds, not by sight. Some bombs fell short. For the American infantry pulled back behind the line. The impact came without warning. The ground erupted among men who believed they were finally safe, who had been told the worst would fall ahead of them. In seconds, safety became illusion. Bodies were thrown. Foxholes collapsed. Medics ran forward into falling debris, unsure where the danger truly lay. Among the dead was General Robert K. Lawson. He had not been leading an attack or issuing orders under fire. He was there to observe, to understand how the breakthrough would unfold, to carry lessons forward for future battles. A single explosion near his position ended that purpose instantly. When his body was recovered, there was little to identify him by, only rank insignia and a ring that survived when flesh did not. Word of his death moved quietly. There were reasons for that. Morale had to be protected. Plans still depended on secrecy and momentum. Public acknowledgement would come later, stripped of detail, wrapped in ceremony. In the moment, there was only a muted reckoning among those who knew the truth. Commanders who had authorized the bombing understood what this meant. The operation had succeeded. The line had been broken. But the cost was no longer abstract. It wore familiar faces. It carried American names. Victory, when it arrived, did not feel triumphant. It felt heavy. Men advanced through the aftermath with a different silence, stepping past bodies that wore their own uniforms, grappling with a truth no briefing could soften. Modern war had delivered its promise. It had broken the enemy, and it had demanded payment from those it was meant to save. When the dust finally settled, the war did not pause to reflect on what had been done. American armor surged forward through gaps that no longer resembled defenses. Roads that had been death traps days earlier now lay open, stripped of resistance, littered with the remains of positions that had simply ceased to exist. Speed returned to the battlefield, and with it came a truth that was impossible to ignore. The balance had shifted permanently. For General Karl Weissman, survival felt less like fortune and more like accusation. He walked through what had once been his division and struggled to recognize it as a place where men had lived, planned, and believed. There were no lines left to hold, no formations to reassemble. Only fragments, broken vehicles, silent craters, and soldiers whose eyes no longer followed movement. In later reflections, Weissman would write sparingly, not about tactics or mistakes, but about limits. He concluded that training, discipline, and courage, qualities he had spent a lifetime cultivating, had encountered something they could not withstand. This was not defeat by a better maneuver. It was erasure by scale. The breakthrough that followed carried Allied forces out of the hedgerows and into open country, unleashing a tempo of movement that could not be reversed. The collapse spread outward, not because every German unit had been destroyed, but because the certainty that resistance could hold had been broken. What had happened outside Saint-Lô was not merely a successful operation. It was a revelation. Modern war no longer asked who was braver or more skilled. It asked who could deliver overwhelming force, faster and in greater volume than the other side could endure. The battlefield had expanded upward into the sky, where decisions were executed by engines and payloads beyond human negotiation. That day marked the moment when warfare changed its face, not with a declaration, but with a lesson written into the earth itself. No formation, no matter how elite, could survive when industry, technology, and time aligned against it. From that morning forward, armies would still march and fight, but they would do so under a sky that could end everything in minutes. The story of General Karl Weissman is not ultimately a story about defeat. It is a story about recognition. Weissman did everything a commander was trained to do. He prepared his men. He believed in discipline, experience, and professionalism. He commanded an elite division forged by doctrine and hardened by survival. In any earlier era of warfare, those qualities would have been enough to endure, to adapt, and perhaps even to prevail. Yet in a single morning outside St. Lo, all of that preparation collided with a new reality, one that did not measure human effort in courage or competence, but in scale, speed, and industrial power. Weizmann survived, but what he witnessed stayed with him. He saw an army not defeated by another army, but erased by a system. 45 minutes of overwhelming force accomplished what weeks of fighting could not. The lesson was not personal failure. It was a historical turning point. War had crossed a threshold where individual excellence could no longer shield men from decisions made far above them, carried out by machines moving faster than human judgment. That realization extends far beyond the battlefield. In our own lives, many people still believe that effort alone guarantees security, that skill, experience, or past success will always be enough. But the modern world, like modern war, changes suddenly. Technology advances, systems grow larger, forces beyond individual control reshape careers, industries, and entire ways of living. The lesson is not to abandon discipline or preparation, but to recognize their limits. True resilience today comes from awareness, from understanding when the environment has changed, from adapting before the ground shifts beneath your feet, and from knowing when survival means redefining success, not clinging to old definitions of victory. Weizmann learned that lesson under the darkest of skies. We are fortunate enough to learn it without bombs falling. Now, a question for you. Do you believe success in life today depends more on individual skill or on adapting quickly to change? A. Individual skill and discipline. B. The ability to adapt and recognize change. Comment A or B below. And what do you think this story says about leadership, resilience, or the world we live in now? Share your thoughts in the comments so others can learn from your perspective. If you found this story meaningful, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue bringing powerful, thoughtful stories like this, stories that connect history to the challenges we face today.